welcome to the summit. For anybody that isn't aware of your work, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you've ended up spending the past 30 years researching habits?
Yes, I'm a social psychologist, and I started out studying how people change attitudes and opinions. And what became clear is that we know a lot about that. And as psychologists, we're actually pretty good at that. But we're not so good at changing behavior. And we're certainly not good at changing behavior in ways so that it sticks. I mean, all of us know we should be living healthier lives, we should be saving more money for retirement, but just that knowledge doesn't easily translate into our behavior. And that's what I was interested in, is how do you get people to change behavior and make it so that they persist over time? Because so much of what we try to achieve in life requires that sort of persistence, that sort of stick-to-itiveness, so that we actually meet the health goals that we have, we meet our saving goals, we have supportive relationships with other people. That requires persistence. And that's something that psychologists don't know a whole lot about. And that's how I started studying habit.
Fantastic. So there's, in your book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, you mentioned a statistic which I found pretty shocking. Something like 43% of our time is spent in doing habits, or like that's 43% of our day is spent in the process of habits. So what I want to ask is, why is it so important to learn about how to control this part of our lives? Why is it such an important subject?
Well, I think you identified the most important reason is because habits are so pervasive. We think of our habits as things like, well, how I brush my teeth or how I type on a computer. But really, the research that we've done shows that they pervade all parts of our lives. So that, as you said, 43% of the time, we are repeating what we've done before in the past in a very similar way. And we're doing it without thinking about what we're doing. So we actually assessed people as they were going through their lives to figure out what they were thinking about. We beeped them once an hour, and we had them report what they were doing and what they were thinking. And that's where we came up with this statistic that 43% of their behavior is repeated on a regular basis while they're thinking about something else. And all kinds of behaviors fit that description. So it's not just the kinds of little one-offs that I was talking about, like brushing your teeth. Instead, we tend to repeat behaviors in that way when we're talking to people that we talk to on a regular basis, when we are working in standard ways that we've done in the past. So much of our lives are propelled by habit. And that's part of the reason also why I wrote the book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, is try to explain to people exactly how much of what we do is habitual and how it's such an important component of our daily life.
Mm. So I want to maybe now explore more about the benefits of this. So in the book, you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg and Barack Obama and how they wear the same clothes with pretty much every day during their work. Why did they do that, and why is that important?
Well, it's an example of a habit that they're using to simplify their lives and their decision making, because that's the basis of a habit. Is it's efficient. It's something you can do without thinking, and you get a reasonably good, you're reasonably productive, it's reasonably rewarding for you to do it in the same way that you've done it before. So Mark Zuckerberg and Barack Obama wear the same, or they wore the same clothes on a regular basis. And Obama said the reason for that was because then he doesn't have to make a decision about something that to him was pretty trivial. So he got a good enough outcome by repeating what he had done in the past. And that's what habits do for us, is when you repeat a behavior over and over in the same way, in the same context, and you get rewarded for it, your brain learns that this is a reasonable response to give in this situation. And after a while, it just becomes automatic so that you're in that situation again and you just do what you did before. It was good enough. It reliably gets a reward. Obama gets to go on with his day and not fuss anymore about what he's wearing. And so it's working for him. So he can do that automatically. And so much of our life is lived that way. We're just in what is called satisficing, doing things that are good enough, that have worked in the past. And that allows us to go on and think about things that are more important, make decisions that are more important, have experiences that we can think about. Our habits free us up to do that.
Fantastic. So, Wendy, what's your definition of habits?
I think of habits as a sort of a mental shortcut. They're shortcuts of what to do in this situation that's likely to meet your goals or get you some reward. And they're based on the past. So you're really responding based on what worked in the past, because habits are a kind of a memory system that we have. And we actually share that memory system with all mammals. So your dog has habits, whales have habits, we have habits. It's a way of learning from our past experience. And I think of it as when something happens to you on a regular basis and you give a response on a regular basis, your brain is wired to connect that to the context in which you are performing the behavior so that you don't have to think in the future. And only the most important experiences, the ones that are repeated over and over in the same way, are coded into habit memory. So it's really capturing, habit memories capture regularities in our experience that are important because they happen so often. And it gives us a ready response when we're in the same situation again.
That's really interesting. So, in the book, you have a chapter titled Your Second Self, I think. Could you tell us a bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so we think of ourselves as like a unit, right? I'm a person, I'm a whole. But our brains didn't actually evolve like that. Our brains evolved over time in sort of fits and starts. So some pieces developed, others fell away over time, and everything was built on top of what was already there. The end result is that we have these different neural circuits in our brain that are specialized to do different sorts of things. Habit memory, as I've said, is the memory that we have of past responses that worked for us. But the self that we know more about, the self that we consciously experience, actually is a different part of our brain. It's executive control, it's decision making, it's our episodic memories, memories of specific experiences. Those are the things that we have conscious access to. So the habit part of our brain is really like a second self. It's a self that we are not consciously aware of, but it's one that's working for us all the time. So you can think of yourself, you probably have actually more than two selves, But you have at least two selves. You have a conscious decision-making self that you're aware of, that you know about, that you have some control over. And then you have your habit self, which runs off automatically based on what you've practiced in the past. And you don't have to make any decisions for your habits to come into play. Instead, they're cued automatically by the environments around us.
One of the examples in the book that I found really illuminating was the example, I think you were using an example of somebody who's like cooking a curry, and the first time they do it, the first time they do it and the 10th time they do it, it looks the same to an outside observer. But if you were to put them in like an MRI scanner and look at their brain, there is a completely different activity going on there. It's a completely different internal experience. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, researchers have actually done similar studies, not I don't think with cooking curry, but with doing tasks. At the beginning, when you first do it, you actually have to think about the sequences. If you're making curry, you have to think how much, when does it go in, what's it supposed to look like. You're thinking all the time about what to do. Around the 10th or the 100th time that you do it, assuming that you like the curry and you keep making it, it becomes more automated. You don't have to think anymore. Instead, you can ruminate about something that happened yesterday or plan what you're going to do after your meal. It allows you, that sort of automaticity allows you to problem solve about other things and then just repeat the behavior that you've done in the past. So it's very functional. And as you say, from an outside observer, it looks like we're thinking all the time. But instead, the brain mechanisms that have taken over when you repeat a behavior have to do with habit memory system. And you're really much more on autopilot. Now, it's like when you're driving though, if something happens that's different from what happened in the past, all of a sudden your conscious self comes back online, right? And you're there problem solving. And sometimes, I mean, I think most people have had this experience when you're driving, you think, oh my gosh, what did I think about? What was I doing for the past 20 minutes? Well, I was driving and I got somewhere. How did I do that? Well, that's an experience of being driven by habit, working on through habit memory, because we don't have access to the habit memory system itself. Again, it goes along with this memory system is so important that your brain has figured out ways to hide it so that you can't change the information in it. There are some things that are so important. Once we learn them and learn them well, we keep them. So it's hidden from our consciousness, and we just follow along without having to think or being aware of it.
Really interesting. So another thing you bring up in the book is this idea that we kind of over attribute, or we put too much emphasis on conscious intentions, especially when it comes to sticking to things. And could you maybe tell us a bit more about, is there a link between setting a big conscious intention and actually persisting in a behavior? Is there a big association there or not? And if not, why might that be?
Well, it has to do with our two selves again. Our decision-making self is really good at starting things. And so making those decisions and setting a conscious intention is how we start something new. But how we stick with things is really through habit. Our conscious intention is just it's too flexible. It's too malleable. If we decide something's a little hard, or we get distracted, or we see someone else do something different than what we had planned, we might change our minds, and we often do. But the habit memory system, that's what persists. And research has shown that that's how people who are really successful at what they're doing, that's how they do it. So we watch writers who are turning out regular sheets of pages, and athletes who are practicing on a regular basis, and we think, wow, those people have amazing willpower. But if you study what they're actually doing, they have structured the practice so that at least starting it is a habit. Now, you can't write out of habit, right? You can't actually create something. So what happens is some days are good writing days, other days are bad writing days, but really productive writers have habits that they have formed to get them starting writing. And then what happens, but they're back again the next day doing it. And it's the same with athletes. It's not something that requires superhuman self-control, which is what it looks like from outside. But they've figured out how to structure their environment to form habits that allow them to be continuously productive.
It's really interesting. So that's probably a good way to move into the next part of the interview, Wendy. So maybe we could start talking about now about the major things that are important when it comes to forming new habits and also breaking bad habits as well. I think in the book you mentioned four kind of key things that people can do.
Yes. So last time that you tried to change some behavior, my guess is you formed a strong intention, got your effort up, really focused, and tried hard. And it may have worked for a while, probably did work for a while, but if you're like the average person, it may not have worked for much longer than a few weeks. We know that it's only a few weeks because we even have a cultural institution, New Year's resolutions, where people make these decisions to change, knowing, most of us, that we won't actually persist beyond a few weeks after New Year's. But we're hopeful. We hope this time it's going to be different. The problem is that, as I said, our intentions, our decision-making self is very flexible. And once we get tired of something, or it starts to seem hard, or other people seem to be having much more fun doing whatever they're doing, we decide to revert back to whatever it was we were doing before. We lose our self-control, our willpower. It just sort of fades over time. A better approach, one that's more successful for people, is to form a habit, is to change your behavior in a way so that you're trying to automate it. You're not trying to achieve a particular outcome, but you're trying to automate the behavior that will allow you to achieve that outcome. It's a different way of thinking about behavior change. So if you're trying to form a habit, repetition is the first key concept that you really need to repeat a behavior on a regular basis in the same way. So let's say you want to get fit. You look very fit already, but let's say you want to improve your fitness. So what you would do is not so much focus on the outcome of being fit, but instead, what kind of behavior can you repeat on a regular basis that will help you get there? So going to the gym on a regular basis, or working out at home, or figuring out some way to go running. And you do it in the same way each time. Second construct is reward, that we're more likely to repeat behaviors that we find rewarding in some way, that are enjoyable. So back to the New Year's resolution example. There was a great study, it wasn't mine, great study done on New Year's resolutions, where they contacted people 3 months after New Year's and asked them what their resolutions were, asked them how successful they'd been about keeping them, and then they asked them something else that was interesting. They asked, so how much fun would this resolution really be to do? And they also asked them how life-changing it would be. Now, we make resolutions because we want to change our lives. So you'd think that it would be the really life-changing resolutions that people would stick with. But that isn't what happened. Instead, it was the ones that were fun. Because we're simply more likely to repeat behaviors that we enjoy than ones that seem more work, even if they're life-changing. So finding some way to make the behavior fun is going to help you form a habit because you're going to repeat it more often. There's also a neurochemical, dopamine, sometimes called the feel-good chemical. It actually does a lot of different things in our brain, but one of the things it does is it helps us form habits. So you're not likely to form a habit for something that is not enjoyable to you, simply because you're not going to have that release of dopamine. And so you're not going to have the neural mechanism tying together all of that information that you have in memory into a habit. So enjoyment is really important too. So we have repetition, rewards, or enjoyment. The third thing that's just as important is context, because, and context refers to performance context, what's around you when you're doing something. Habits are cued by the context we're in. So I have a habit, come downstairs in the morning and I make coffee. I stand in front of the coffee machine. I don't ask myself, do I want coffee this morning? Or am I going to make it? Or how am I going to make it? I stand there and I just do what I've done before. I couldn't really tell you what I do, to be honest. My coffee maker's complex. And fortunately, it's become sufficiently automatic that I don't have to think much anymore. And I'm not sure I could describe to you exactly the detail, the steps in detail. But when I'm standing there, each step is cued by what I did before. And that context makes it easy for me to form, to make coffee because I'm following my habit. So contexts are really important for habit formation. You want that context to be stable. If the context is varying, you're going to have to think a lot and you won't be forming a habit.
Can we just go back to the rewards, the second thing you mentioned? One of the things in the book that I found really interesting was that rewards work best when they're uncertain, when there's some degree of uncertainty around them. Why is that? And how can people practically apply that to trying to build habits in their own life?
It's a good question. Rewards that are uncertain or intermittent, you're absolutely right, do build habits faster, more reliably. And that's because of the dopamine mechanism. Because dopamine is released most when we get an uncertain or unexpected reward. And you can see that in gambling, slot machines, that it's the unexpected reward, right? Most of the time you put money in, you get nothing. But every once in a while, you get a huge jackpot, and it's incredibly rewarding. And it keeps people putting money into those machines over and over again. The same thing happens with our cell phones, right? Tech companies know that we're very susceptible, very responsive to these inconsistent, uncertain rewards. And it keeps us checking our email, keeps us checking social media sites, because most of the time we don't learn anything that's that interesting. Um, Certainly not anything that would merit checking our cell phones like 80 times a day, which is what people do on average. I think it's actually more than 80. Most of the time when we check our cell phones, we learn nothing. But every once in a while, we get some very useful piece of information, and that keeps us checking over and over again. That builds a habit of checking our cell phones. Just like in a casino, people have formed habits to put money into the slot. Now, how you use that yourself is more challenging, but keep in mind that the rewards that are provided on a regular basis, that we don't respond to those quite as much as rewards that are occasional. So if you're trying to do something really nice for your relationship partner, your spouse, doing something that's out of the ordinary is going to be much more rewarding to them than doing something that you have done many times in the past before. And that's that same phenomenon.
Very interesting. And another important point I think you make in the book is that we're not rats, and that like if you, if you do something that is intrinsically rewarding, you shouldn't be like eating a piece of chocolate after to like link the habit with the reward. Can you tell us a bit more about that and the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards as well?
Yes. So the point of that example was, as you say, that all rewards are not the same. The rewards that build habits are the ones that you experience when you are doing the behavior. So giving yourself some bonus at the end of the week isn't going to help you actually form a habit. Instead, it's feeling good right when you're doing something, because that dopamine works for about a minute to tie together all of the information that you have in memory at the time and start to build a habit. If you wait too long, the dopamine has gone away and it doesn't work as effectively. So you want to make sure that the behavior that you're doing is immediately effective, immediately rewarding. And intrinsic rewards typically come immediately. So habits build really well with intrinsic rewards, something that is inherent to the activity, something that makes you love the activity itself. But extrinsic rewards can also be immediate. You just have to be careful to make them that way. So I used to be a runner, and I loved running. It was very rewarding to me. I had a strong running habit. But as you get older, those things don't always, not as easy. So I started using an elliptical. And if you've ever worked out on an elliptical machine in the gym, it is the most boring thing you can ever do. So I was having a hard time making myself do it until I figured out that I can actually watch stupid TV shows or read trashy novels while I'm working out. And I don't do that normally, but when I work out, I do, and it actually makes the whole thing very rewarding. And I now look forward to working out once I figured out that twist. It's not enough to feel good at the end of the week if you've actually made yourself work out several times. Instead, it has to be contiguous with the behavior itself. It has to be simultaneous, something you experience as you're doing it.
So a huge part of this, Wendy, seems to be cues. Like cues seem to be so fundamental to forming habits. So maybe we could now cover ways people can create cues for different habits. Things like habit stacking, for example. Can we maybe explore that there a little bit?
Yeah, so if you want to form a new habit, one quick sort of shortcut to doing that is to take advantage of some of the habits you already have and stack the new behavior onto something else that's already automatic. And many people do this already. If they're trying to remember to take medication, they might put the pill bottle next to their toothbrush, because we have a habit of brushing our teeth at least once a day, usually twice. And if you need to take meds, that's a good time to do it. And that kind of stacking is helpful because you can then integrate taking the pill into an existing habit. And now, so many of us are worried about the virus. We have new behaviors to learn, right? In the US, we're all very focused on wearing masks these days. Remembering to do that can be a challenge unless you stack it onto some behavior that you already have. So I keep a stack of masks right by my front door, and I stacked it onto putting shoes on. Put my shoes on, put my mask on, then leave. If I do that, I'm much more likely to remember it and much more likely to form it into a habit.
So it's sort of like you're outsourcing these things to your environment, and your environment's prompting you to perform the behavior you want to perform.
Exactly, exactly. And that's actually a good point. That is like the fourth pillar of habit formation, things that we should know, which is that some environments make it easier for us to learn habits than others. And recognizing the importance of that cueing by our environment is critical to habit formation. So one of the studies I talk about in the book was done by a data analytics firm that tracked people as they were going to the gym. So what they did is they actually tracked the cell phones, but there were people holding them, to see how far people traveled to a gym and how often they went. And they did this for 2 months, hundreds of thousands of cell phones. What they discovered was that if people traveled about 3.5 miles to a gym, to a paid fitness center, they went 5 times a month. But if they had to travel over 5 miles, they went only once a month. Showing that, I mean, we think that going to the gym is our personal decision, right? I go when I want to, I don't go when I don't want to. But the context in which we're in, how much friction there is or resistance to us doing something, makes a big difference in how often we repeat a behavior and how easy it is to form a habit. Marketers know this really well. They're very focused on friction. If you go into a store, for retailers, there's a saying, eye level is buy level, meaning what you see on the shelf in front of you is what you're more likely to buy. If you have to look down, that's a slight amount of resistance, and you're just much less likely to buy stuff down there because it's harder. It's not where you're naturally looking. So they put all the cheap stuff down by your feet, and they put the more expensive stuff up higher where you can see it to encourage you to buy it. And it works pretty well because that friction in our environment really does determine what we repeat.
That's interesting and also kind of evil that marketers do that, but good to know, I suppose. So
I actually think that following some of these things is very helpful for people because it gives us an idea of how to reverse engineer, right? The forces that are encouraging us to do things that we may not want to do. So with online shopping, there's the one-click purchase. So Amazon stores our credit cards, stores our address. We don't have to put anything in. We just click on an item and it gets sent to us. That one click was a tremendous innovation for Amazon. And they actually had a patent on it for a while because they know that one click people buy stuff, 2 clicks, they lose customers because that's friction. So if you're actually trying to buy less online, if you want to take control of that, reverse engineer it and don't use the 1-click system. Don't fall prey to that because it doesn't give you really time to think. Is this something I want? Does it fit into my budget? Is there something cheaper? So being aware of how these things work, I think, is very helpful to people because it empowers you.
Fantastic. So another important point, I think, is people that form habits well, they have a very interesting use of self-control. Their day-to-day self-control isn't going into like daily decisions about what to do in this situation or that situation. It seems to be that they use a lot of their effort and willpower to create habits and systems and everything that just make life almost automatic for them. So it frees up their conscious mind to solve bigger problems in day-to-day life. Can you expand a bit more on that there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's like your Barack Obama and Zuckerberg examples. They have figured out how to streamline the things that they don't think are critical, which gives them an opportunity to focus on what is. And that's actually something that we have learned about self-control in the past decade. Completely changed the way people think about self-control. So there are scales to measure self-control. And you can take them, they're all online. You can take them, figure out how much self-control you have based on these personality scales. We used to think that the people who scored high on those scales, well, let me say first, we do know that people who score high on those scales are very successful in life. So they are the people who don't have overdrafts at the bank, they get work done on time, they have positive relationships, they weigh less, they exercise more. I mean, these are people who are meeting their goals. So having high self-control on these scales is a good thing, right? It leads to all these positive life outcomes. We used to think that people who had high self-control achieved those outcomes because they were denying themselves the temptations, they were single-mindedly focused on achieving those goals. They were just better than the rest of us at exerting willpower. But what we learned in the last decade is that it's not true. They, as you say, are really good at forming habits. So they're good at forming study habits. They're good at forming work habits. They're good at relationship habits. So they are able to structure their environment to make these behaviors easy, and they reliably achieve these goals that many of us look at them and think, oh, that's more willpower than I have, but they're misunderstanding how this works. When you look at really successful people, what those people have most likely done is they have set up environments to make it easy for them to be successful. It's a very different way of thinking about self-control. Self-control through habit, not self-control through effortful willpower.
Like the Puritan kind of way.
Yes, exactly.
So the four, I think that framework is really powerful. Just the rewards, repetition, removing friction, and creating a context. Okay, so that's for anyone that's wanting to build a new habit. That's like 4 scientifically proven ways that you can do that. But what's also so great about this is that if you want to break a bad habit, it seems to be that you can just reverse engineer the process. So like, for example, you can just make it try and add friction as opposed to removing friction. So like, let's say that I wanted to give up coffee, right? And then I just like, how do I add friction to that habit, for example? And how do I create a context around that?
Yes, exactly. You want to give up coffee, you want to stop looking at your cell phone as much. What you do is you make it more difficult for yourself to do those things. So let me switch to a cell phone example, because I think a lot of people have trouble controlling a cell phone. Just the simple act of taking your cell phone and putting it face down makes it a little bit more difficult for you to look at it in a meeting, when you're having dinner with friends or with your family. So reducing reducing the visibility of it, making it a bit more difficult to access. Leaving it at home is probably the best way to reduce access to it, although it does mean that you don't have all of the cell phone functions. So another possible solution is just to have a zippered pocket in your briefcase or your backpack where you keep your cell phone. So you have to think a bit before you pull it out. It's not just there at the ready waiting for you. You have to make a decision. And that decision gives you enough time to think, is this something I want to do, really? Is it consistent with my goals? You're not responding automatically to the cues around you.
I'm curious as well, Wendy, just before we finish up, because you're like one of the leading researchers in the world on habit formation, do you feel any kind of pressure to be like, have like amazing habits all the time? Do you feel that in any way?
Oh, um, psychologists are people. And we are all challenged in life like everyone else. I think what studying habits teaches you to do is it teaches you to forgive yourself, because you realize that if you're not successful at something, it's not necessarily that you don't have willpower, you didn't want it enough, there was something wrong with you. You just need a slightly better strategy. So rethinking your strategy is where you end up. And that leads to a bit more sense of forgiveness, perhaps.
For sure, for sure. And I'm curious, are there any habits that have been really beneficial in your career as a psychologist? Because I know there's going to be a lot of psychology students listening to this. Anything that's benefited you?
I, yes, I have writing habits that I am that I protect, so that in my day, I found that it's easiest for me to write first thing in the morning. Some people find it easiest to write late at night. Depends on when your brain is most active. When you figure that out, try to structure that part of your day so that it's devoted to writing, reading, whatever the project is that you're working on right now, and defend that. So structure it in, just like you do breakfast and lunch, or just like you do sleeping. Make sure that you give yourself the time that you need in order to be successful. And if you do that on a regular basis, you'll find that you're actually much more productive than you thought you could be. We have some research that we're doing right now on creativity, showing that at creative tasks, if people form habits to how to approach the task, they generate many more solutions to these creative tasks. But even more important, they're more creative solutions. So the habit is sort of the infrastructure that allows you to produce. And then the creativity is what comes. It comes because you're not spending your time thinking, so how am I going to approach this task? How am I going to get myself to do it? When should I stop? Instead, you have habits that regulate all of those decisions. And then you can focus on what's really important, on being creative, producing at the level that you can.
Fantastic. It reminds me of a quote from the book. It's called The War of Art, and he's all about giving structure to your creative work. And it's something like, I only write when inspiration strikes, but luckily she strikes every morning at 9 a.m. So it's the same idea, you know.
It is. It is. Yep. You
Um,
need you need both in order to be successful. Yep. Both
100%.
that inspiration, creativity, and the infrastructure to do it.
100%. Well, Wendy, just before we go, have you got any parting advice, like one kind of key takeaway you'd like people to take away from this interview about how to how to take control of their habits?
Um, let me offer um, maybe another illustration of habit change, which is my favorite study right now. My favorite study varies with time, but this is an old one from back in the 1980s. And this was a study on the environment and how to get people to take the stairs and not the elevator. So what researchers did, this was in an office building, they put up a bunch of signs, um, save the environment, take the stairs, don't use electricity in the elevator. No effect. Everybody kept taking the elevator. They just ignored the signs. What the researchers did is then they thought, well, let's try something different. Let's try adding a little bit of friction to taking the elevator. So they slowed the closing of the elevator door by 16 seconds. A third of the people who had taken the elevator started taking the stairs. So they changed the behavior of a third of the people that they wanted to change, which is really quite powerful. But what was even more impressive is when they sped up the elevator to its normal speed again, about 4 weeks later, people kept taking the stairs. They'd formed a habit. They didn't want to fuss with this slow, inconsistent elevator, so they just kept taking the stairs. That friction was enough to propel people to form new habits. And to the extent that we can control our environment in that way, we're going to be so much more successful at getting ourselves to do the right thing. Just reminding ourselves this is better for the environment, it doesn't work that well. But if we can restructure the environment itself, and we can, to make some behaviors easier, others more difficult, then we'll be more successful.
That's a great point to end on. Any website or any social media links people can check out, Wendy?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Prof. Wendy Wood, also Instagram, and I have a Facebook site for the book, Wendy Wood Author page, yes.
Brilliant. Well, I'm reading the book at the minute, and for anyone that is interested in the subject of habits and sort of just taking more control of this area of your life, the book is really accessible, really interesting, packed with like stories, studies, and it's like there's a lot of books on habits out there, but I haven't found any as scientifically backed as this one. It's really a great piece of work. So, Wendy, thank you for writing it, and thanks a million for taking the time to share some of your knowledge and wisdom with us today. I really appreciate it.
Good to talk with you now.